The story of World War II doesn't begin with gunfire or explosions. It begins with silence, long, uncertain silence, that settled over Europe after the end of the First World War. That earlier war, fought between 1914 and 1918, had left the world exhausted. It had consumed empires, redrawn borders, and ended millions of lives. It was supposed to be the war to end all wars. But even as the last soldiers returned home, the seeds of something larger, something more far-reaching, had already taken root. In 1919, leaders gathered at the Palace of Versailles, just outside Paris, surrounded by chandeliers and tapestries. They signed a treaty they believed would bring lasting peace. But the Treaty of Versailles, though written in ink, carved deep wounds across the map of Europe. Germany, the defeated power, was made to accept full responsibility for the war. It lost colonies, land, and pride. The treaty imposed reparations so enormous that they crushed the German economy. And while the ink dried, inflation began to rise, slowly at first, then all at once, stretching household budgets thin and eroding trust in both government and money itself. By the early 1920s, Germany was spiraling. Money lost its meaning. A loaf of bread could cost a wheelbarrow of banknotes by morning. People bartered for necessities, or did without, in cities like Berlin and Munich. Political factions clashed in the streets. Communists, monarchists, and nationalists all fought for influence. Amid this unrest, a man named Adolf Hitler began to speak at beer halls and rallies. His message was simple. Germany had been betrayed, and he would make it strong again. At first, he was a fringe figure, but over time, support grew. His words, filled with blame and promise, resonated with people who had lost faith in the government. By 1933, Hitler had been appointed Chancellor. Within months, democracy unraveled. The Reichstag burned. Civil liberties were suspended. Opponents were arrested. The Nazi regime, cloaked in symbolism and driven by ideology, had begun its climb. It would use fear, spectacle, and propaganda to reshape Germany from within. Long before the first tanks rolled, long before the world truly understood what was coming. Germany wasn't alone in its unrest. In Italy, another man had seized power by tapping into fear and frustration. Benito Mussolini came to power in 1922, marching on Rome with black-shirted supporters. He declared a new era for Italy, one rooted in order, strength, and national revival. The old institutions gave way to fascism, a system that prized the state above the individual and authority above dissent. Mussolini's Italy was not yet as aggressive as Nazi Germany would become, but it lit a path others would follow, showing how nationalism, militarism, and spectacle could be used to consolidate power and rally a nation behind conquest. Further east, Japan was undergoing changes of its own. It had industrialized rapidly in the late 1800s, becoming a formidable regional power, but it lacked natural resources like oil, coal, and rubber to secure them. It looked outward. In 1931, Japan staged a railway explosion as a pretext to invade Manchuria, a region of northern China rich in minerals and farmland. The League of Nations condemned the invasion, but did nothing to stop it. Japan responded by leaving the League entirely. It was a sign that international institutions designed to prevent future wars were losing their authority, and that the balance of power was shifting toward nations willing to act unilaterally, regardless of consequences. The war in China became one of the longest and bloodiest fronts of World War II. But in these early years, before the rest of the world had even realized what was coming. Japan's invasion marked a shift in how international norms were enforced. For the first time since 1918, a powerful nation had taken territory by force and gotten away with it. Elsewhere, another conflict was unfolding that seemed small at first, but would foreshadow much of what was to come. In Spain in 1936, a civil war broke out between the elected Republican government and a group of nationalist rebels led by General Francisco Franco. Hitler and Mussolini quickly supported Franco with aircraft, tanks, and soldiers. The Republicans received limited help from volunteers and the Soviet Union, but they were outmatched. Germany used the Spanish Civil War to test its new air force, deploying bombers like the Heinkel and the Junkers, which dropped explosives not just on military targets but on civilian towns, turning Spanish skies into a preview of what was coming for Europe. Franco won in 1939. Just as the larger war in Europe was beginning to take shape, Spain remained officially neutral during World War II. But the lessons of its civil war echoed loudly. Authoritarianism could spread not just through conquest, but through collapse. And while Spain fell into dictatorship, other nations watched nervously, wondering whether their own democratic institutions would hold. The League of Nations, formed after the First World War to prevent future conflict, proved powerless. Its resolutions were ignored, its condemnations toothless. As Germany, Italy, and Japan expanded their reach, the League stood silent. The idea of collective peace began to feel fragile. One by one, the rules that had been agreed upon in Versailles were bent, then broken. Even in countries not yet involved, fear began to settle into daily life. In Britain and France, leaders were hesitant to confront aggression. Memories of the trenches of poison gas and endless mud were still fresh. The public wanted peace, not confrontation. So when Germany broke parts of the Versailles Treaty, such as rearming its military or occupying the Rhineland, there were protests but no action. Through the early and mid-1930s, these shifts might have felt isolated. One country here, one skirmish there. But underneath, they were connected. The world was not just recovering from a past war. It was quietly drifting toward another. And as the pieces moved, as governments fell and borders changed, the people of the world lived their lives in the in-between. They went to school, they planted crops, they danced to jazz records and drank coffee in quiet cafes. Some knew what was coming, most did not. But all of them lived in a world that was changing, slowly, steadily, towards something far larger than anyone could yet imagine. The cracks in the post-war order grew wider as the 1930s progressed. Germany, though weakened by debt and international restrictions, began to rebuild itself under Hitler's rule. The Nazi regime directed resources into public works projects, including the famous Autobahn highway system, and invested heavily in rearmament. New tanks, aircraft, and weapons rolled off production lines in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. While many in Germany welcomed the signs of recovery, few could see where the path was truly leading toward repression, expansion, and a conflict that would stretch far beyond their borders into places they had never imagined. At the same time, Hitler's regime relied on control, carefully managed through spectacle and fear. Giant rallies in Nuremberg displayed ranks of uniformed supporters, their movements choreographed, their voices unified. Radio broadcasts filled homes with speeches. Newspapers printed only what the regime approved. In schools, children were taught loyalty to the Führer before they understood what the word even meant. And in the shadows, people disappeared. Political opponents, dissenters, and Jews were arrested quietly, taken from their homes at night, sent to prisons, camps, or places no one spoke of openly, as fear became a tool of control, and silence settled over the country like a second skin. Across Europe, some looked on with unease, but others were drawn in by the apparent success of authoritarian rule. Italy and Germany formed a growing alliance. Their leaders met, smiled for the cameras, and praised each other's vision. A new order was being imagined, one that would reject liberal democracy, embrace nationalism, and glorify war as a path to strength. Meanwhile, democratic nations hesitated. Britain and France still bore the weight of the previous war, both economically and emotionally. The scars of trench warfare, the staggering cost of lives lost, and the unresolved grief still lingered in memory and policy alike, making every decision feel fragile, every commitment uncertain. In classrooms, young children recited pledges. In quiet towns, statues were erected. In distant capitals, diplomats passed notes and read reports. Everyone seemed to be waiting, watching, hoping the next crisis might be the last. But in truth, the world was slowly slipping from balance. What once had been small sparks, economic hardship, territorial disputes, nationalist pride, were growing into a fire no one seemed able to put out. Technology, too, was advancing. Radio brought distant speeches into local kitchens. Newsreels played footage of foreign armies marching through streets, saluting flags that many people had never seen before. The world was smaller than it had been in 1914. Ideas traveled faster. Images of strength, of unity, of purpose. These were powerful, especially in times of fear, and fear had become a quiet companion in many homes. Fear of war, fear of change, fear of being left behind. In America, the Great Depression had gripped the country tightly. Bread lines stretched down city blocks. Banks failed. Millions were out of work. The United States turned inward, focused on recovery. While aware of rising tensions abroad, most Americans wanted no part in foreign wars. Isolationism took hold. The memory of World War I, its distant causes and close losses, was still too fresh. Congress passed neutrality acts, aiming to keep the country out of conflict, even as alliances abroad were shifting, and the signs of something larger, more dangerous, quietly gathered on the horizon. And yet, connections were everywhere. European immigrants wrote to relatives back home. Ships crossed oceans with cargo and news. Pilots trained in multiple languages. Though governments spoke of borders, the lives of people stretched across them. And so, even in times of silence, the sense of something coming, of movement, of build-up, persisted in subtle ways. In small towns, veterans gathered in halls, remembering the trenches. In big cities, factories switched from producing goods to preparing for what might be next. Some saw what was coming. Others refused to believe it. But history, once again, had begun to move, not in a straight line, but in a series of overlapping currents, political, economic, cultural, all pulling at each other, and beneath it all, the simple hope that peace could last just a little longer. The hope, though gentle, would soon be tested. The years leading up to the outbreak of World War II in Europe were marked not by loud clashes, but by quiet shifts, by speeches and signatures, handshakes and headlines that in hindsight carried far more weight than most people understood at the time. In Germany, the rise of Hitler had already changed the internal structure of the country. But now, the regime's focus turned outward. Foreign policy was guided by two principles: restore German pride and reclaim what had been lost: territory, resources, and the perception of strength that had vanished after the war, even if doing so meant breaking old agreements or setting new fires across Europe. In March 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone along the western border with France. According to the Treaty of Versailles, this was forbidden, but Germany moved forward anyway, and the world hesitated. France, politically divided and weary, did not respond militarily. Britain urged caution, and so the gamble paid off. Encouraged by the lack of resistance, the Nazi regime pushed further. 2 years later, in March of 1938, German forces entered Austria in what became known as the Anschluss, a peaceful invasion masked as unity, where cheering crowds and swastika banners hid the quiet dread felt by those who saw their country vanish overnight. The Anschluss, as it came to be known, was portrayed as a homecoming. Germans uniting under one flag, crowds in Vienna cheered, posters were hung, speeches blared from radios. But beneath the surface, many Austrians were afraid. Those who opposed the Nazis were silenced quickly. Jewish families, in particular, felt the walls closing in. Almost overnight, laws changed, businesses were seized, neighbors became informants, and the world, once again, watched, but did not act. Then came Czechoslovakia. In the western region of that young nation was the Sudetenland, home to many ethnic Germans. Hitler claimed they were being mistreated. Though no independent source could confirm this, he demanded the region be handed over. The Czechoslovak government resisted, but pressure from outside began to build. Britain and France, still desperate to avoid another war, chose negotiation over confrontation. The result was the Munich Agreement, signed in September 1938. Germany would gain the Sudetenland, and in return it promised peace. It was a deal many hoped would prevent another war. But beneath the signatures and handshakes, doubt quietly lingered. At the time, the agreement was celebrated by some as a triumph of diplomacy. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously declared he had secured peace for our time. But peace, as it turned out, was already slipping away. Just months later, in March 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. There had been no referendum, no uprising, no justification beyond ambition. And for the first time, it was clear that Hitler's aims extended far beyond uniting German-speaking people. This moment changed everything. Appeasement, once seen as prudence, now looked like weakness. Britain and France began to rearm more aggressively. Military budgets increased. Public opinion shifted. But even then, few believed that another full-scale war was truly on the horizon. The trauma of the First World War still cast a long shadow. No one wanted to believe it could happen again. Not on that scale, not with that kind of destruction. And so, even as Hitler made plans and moved troops, the rest of the world hesitated, unsure whether his ambitions would stop at borders or sweep beyond them into something far more destructive. In Eastern Europe, countries watched with growing anxiety. Poland, in particular, found itself caught between two powerful neighbors, Germany to the west and the Soviet Union to the east. Its leaders knew that any conflict between those powers would likely involve Polish soil, and while the Polish military was proud, it was also under-equipped for the kind of mechanized warfare Germany had been developing. Throughout the spring and summer of 1939, diplomats worked frantically behind the scenes. Britain and France promised to protect Poland in the event of aggression. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, remained something of an enigma, hostile to Germany's ideology, but wary of the West. Then, on August 23, 1939, a stunning announcement shook the world. Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The two nations, once bitter enemies in both politics and principle, now stood side by side, at least on paper. Secretly, the pact included a hidden clause, agreeing to divide Eastern Europe between them and sealing Poland's fate before a single shot was fired. Publicly, the agreement stated that Germany and the USSR would not attack one another, but in secret, the two powers agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be carved in two. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would fall under Soviet influence. It was a cynical arrangement and a clear sign that war was no longer a question of if, but when. The people of Europe went about their daily lives that August, under skies that felt a little heavier. Markets were busy. Radios buzzed. Newspapers printed updates from embassies and capitals. In cities like Paris, London, and Warsaw, people whispered in cafes and watched the headlines. Soldiers were quietly recalled to bases. Border checkpoints grew more tense. And on September 1st, 1939, it happened. German forces invaded Poland. What had once seemed unthinkable had begun again. The invasion of Poland marked the official beginning of World War II. But for many, it felt like a sudden drop into something that had been slowly building for years. Just before dawn, the first shots were fired near the city of Danzig, today known as Gdansk. German warships opened fire on a Polish garrison stationed at Westerplatte, a small peninsula on the Baltic coast. At the same time, German troops surged across the western border. Bombers roared overhead. Armored columns moved with frightening speed, overwhelming defenses and scattering resistance before most could organize a response. The strategy was fast, overwhelming, and terrifying. German forces used blitzkrieg, lightning war, a new form of military assault that relied on rapid, coordinated attacks by aircraft, tanks, and infantry. The goal was to paralyze the enemy before they had time to mount a defense. Cities were bombed, railways were destroyed, communication lines were cut, and while Polish forces fought back with determination, they were outmatched in both technology and numbers. Within days, German troops had pushed deep into the Low Countries, occupying towns, cutting roads, and surrounding Allied units that had scarcely begun to mobilize. In Warsaw, civilians took shelter in basements and subway tunnels. Firefighters battled flames as bombs fell from the sky. Families clung to radios, hoping for word from the outside world. But the help they hoped for didn't come, not in time. Though Britain and France declared war on Germany just 2 days after the invasion began, they did not launch any major attacks on the Western Front. Their armies mobilized, but held their positions. For the people of Poland, it was a grim realization. They were alone, left to face a storm that no one else was willing to stop. Then, on September 17th, came a second shock. Soviet forces crossed Poland's eastern border, fulfilling their agreement with Germany in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Polish troops found themselves trapped between two advancing armies. Resistance was valiant in many places, at Lwów, at Modlin, and in the forests of eastern Poland. But it could not last. By the beginning of October, organized resistance had collapsed. The government fled to Romania. The country was partitioned. And just like that, Poland, a nation with centuries of history, was erased from the map, divided between two powerful neighbors as the world watched in silence. But even as the maps changed, people remained. Under German occupation, Poland faced one of the most brutal regimes of the war. Universities were shut down. Cultural institutions were destroyed. Intellectuals, clergy, and political leaders were arrested, deported, or killed. Jewish communities, already facing growing persecution, were forced into ghettos, walled-off sections of cities where overcrowding, starvation, and disease spread rapidly. The occupation wasn't just military, it was psychological. In the East, Soviet control came with its own form of suppression. Thousands of Poles were deported to labor camps deep in Siberia. Landowners and professionals were arrested or relocated. Schools were restructured. Churches were closed. The goal was not just control, but transformation, a reshaping of society to fit a new political mold. For the people living through it, the war was not a series of grand battles or speeches. It was a slow erosion of the familiar, replaced by fear and uncertainty. In the West, the response to Poland's fall was cautious and conflicted. Britain and France had declared war, but had little appetite for immediate, large-scale engagement. This created the period known as the Phony War, where both sides waited, watched, and prepared. On the surface, life continued. Children went to school, markets stayed open. But beneath the routine was a sense of tightening tension, like the world was holding its breath. Meanwhile, in Germany, the invasion was presented as a swift and rightful victory. Propaganda celebrated the military's effectiveness. Films and newsreels showed cheering soldiers, not shattered cities, but within military command circles, planning was already underway for the next moves, further campaigns in Scandinavia, and then westward toward France. For Poland, the war had begun in full, but the rest of the world was still only beginning to grasp what lay ahead. One of the defining characteristics of the Polish campaign was the coordination and precision of the German advance. Entire towns were bypassed or surrounded rather than attacked head-on, cutting off supply lines and communication routes before resistance could form. Panzer divisions moved swiftly along country roads, supported by Stuka dive bombers that howled through the skies, striking targets with pinpoint accuracy. Bridges were destroyed, rail hubs rendered useless, and even when Polish units reorganized for counterattacks, they found themselves surrounded, outmaneuvered, or facing relentless airstrikes from above. The psychological impact of blitzkrieg was nearly as significant as the physical destruction. It created a sense of chaos that undermined morale. With front lines moving daily, no one was certain where the enemy was or where it would strike next. Polish civilians, some still in summer clothing, grabbed what they could and fled eastward in horse-drawn carts and trucks. Roads filled with refugees. Families were separated. Strangers traveled together, hoping to find shelter or simply safety a little further down the road, though no one really knew what lay ahead. Within the ghettos, conditions deteriorated quickly. In Warsaw, the largest ghetto, eventually held over 400,000 people, packed into less than 1/10 of the city's area. Food was scarce. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Smuggling became a lifeline. Children crawled through sewer grates or slipped between bricks to bring in bread, onions, or bits of coal. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus became common. And through it all, people tried to hold on to their dignity. Teachers ran secret schools, musicians held quiet performances in courtyards, and families lit candles, not just for light, but for hope. Elsewhere in Poland, resistance began to form, not as organized armies, but as underground networks. The Polish Home Army, or Armia Krajowa, was one of the largest resistance movements in occupied Europe. Members distributed leaflets, gathered intelligence, and sabotaged German supply lines. Even at great personal risk, they believed in keeping Polish identity alive. Libraries, universities, and churches, though banned, were recreated in basements and private homes. It was a quiet kind of defiance, but one that kept identity alive, word by word, page by page, even in the darkest of times. On the Soviet side, a different kind of trauma took root. Thousands of Polish officers were taken prisoner. In the spring of 1940, more than 20,000 of them were executed in what became known as the Katyn massacre, a tragedy denied for decades. Entire communities were emptied overnight as trains carried deportees eastward into remote regions of the Soviet Union. Many would never return. Others came back years later, changed forever by hunger, cold, and loss. It was a war, not just of conquest, but of identity, where borders were redrawn, languages suppressed, and entire ways of life threatened with erasure. As the weeks turned into months, the full consequences of Poland's partition became clearer. Families found themselves split between two regimes. Letters took weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. Some areas changed languages, flags, and laws within days. Birth certificates, currency, and school curriculums were all rewritten. And through it all, life continued in small, strange ways. Weddings still took place, babies were born, and farmers still tried to coax crops from the soil. But nothing felt secure. Not the seasons, not the land, not even the passing of time itself. Outside of Poland, the world struggled to understand the nature of what had occurred. It was not simply a war of armies. It was a dismantling of a nation in broad daylight. The shock of it reached capitals across Europe. But the response remained largely passive. Speeches were made, appeals were filed. But Germany, emboldened by its success and confident in its military strategy, began planning its next move. Poland had fallen quickly. What would come next would be larger and even more complex. The war had begun. But the world had not yet seen just how far it would spread. By the summer of 1940, the map of Europe had been redrawn with startling speed. Much of the continent now lay under German control, from the lowlands of Belgium and the Netherlands to the once proud capital of Paris. France had fallen, divided between occupation in the north and the Vichy regime in the south. And as German forces settled into their new positions, eyes turned across the English Channel to the last remaining stronghold in Western Europe, Britain. For centuries, Britain had relied on its natural moat, those narrow but turbulent waters separating it from the continent. But in the age of aircraft, distance was no longer the shield it once had been. German leaders began planning Operation Sea Lion, the code name for a full-scale invasion of the British Isles. Yet before any boats could be launched, the skies would need to be cleared. Germany needed air superiority, and so began the long, tense days of the Battle of Britain. It started with raids, targeted strikes against radar stations and airfields in southern England. The Luftwaffe hoped to cripple Britain's ability to detect and respond to incoming attacks. But British radar, though still relatively new, proved invaluable. It gave early warning. It bought precious minutes, and in those minutes, fighter pilots scrambled into the sky. The Royal Air Force, or RAF, was outnumbered but determined. Its pilots were young, often barely trained, flying Spitfires and Hurricanes in tight formation. They rose in waves to intercept German bombers and fighter escorts. Dogfights twisted above the green fields and coastal towns. Civilians watched from below, tracking the white trails left behind as aircraft spun and dove in tight, deadly spirals. As the weeks passed, the nature of the air war began to shift. When strikes on airfields failed to achieve the desired results, the Luftwaffe changed tactics. London became the target. Day after day, and then night after night, bombs fell on the city. Fires spread. Entire blocks were reduced to rubble. The sound of air raid sirens became as familiar as the toll of a bell. Families slept in underground stations, bringing blankets and books, waiting for the all clear. This period became known as the Blitz. It was relentless, yet strangely rhythmic. Each night brought explosions. Each morning revealed the damage. Fire brigades worked through smoke and falling debris. Volunteers cleared glass from sidewalks. Neighbors helped neighbors rebuild. The goal was survival and defiance. Through it all, Prime Minister Winston Churchill became a voice of resolve. He gave speeches on the radio, his words slow and full of weight. "We shall fight on the beaches," he declared. "We shall never surrender." The people clung to those words, even as the walls trembled. By October, the tide had begun to shift. The RAF held firm. German losses mounted. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. Britain had survived the onslaught. The invasion never came. But the skies remained dangerous. Bombs would continue to fall, even into the following year. Still, something had changed. For the first time in the war, Hitler had been denied a victory. And across the world, that small island nation, battered but unbroken, stood as a symbol of resistance and a reminder that the war was far from over. Though the invasion had been halted, the war in the skies did not end. With Operation Sea Lion postponed, Germany doubled down on its campaign of aerial bombardment. The Blitz, as it came to be known, would stretch on, night after night, bringing thunder from the heavens and fire to the streets of Britain. London was hit hardest. By day, people worked and waited. By night, they braced for the hum of engines overhead, for the whistle of falling bombs. Some nights brought silence, others brought chaos. Entire city blocks disappeared in flashes of flame. Fires leapt from building to building, lighting the sky in flickering orange. Searchlights danced across the clouds, trying to track the source of the destruction. Underground, life adapted. Subway tunnels became makeshift shelters. Families brought pillows and sleeping bags, settling in beside strangers. Children clutched dolls. Parents whispered stories, trying to push fear away with familiar words. Volunteers served tea. Radios played softly in the background. In these shared spaces, bonds formed, not just of survival, but of community. Above ground, the destruction was almost surreal. Buildings stood with walls missing, staircases exposed to the open air. Firefighters worked without pause, even as bombs fell around them. Civil defense workers, air raid wardens, nurses, and ambulance crews moved through the smoke, helping where they could. No one was untouched. Even the royal family refused to flee the capital, choosing to remain in Buckingham Palace after it too was bombed. Yet despite the damage, the fear, and the loss, something held steady. People began to refer to it simply as the spirit, a kind of quiet strength, the ability to keep going, to reopen shops in half-destroyed storefronts, to sweep up broken glass in the morning and plant flowers beside the rubble. In smaller towns and villages, the fear remained. But the bombs came less often. Still, children were evacuated to the countryside. They arrived with tags around their necks, carrying small suitcases and gas masks. Many had never left the city before. They were welcomed by families they didn't know, placed in schools with different accents, surrounded by fields instead of brick and stone. It was disorienting, but it was safe. Meanwhile, across the country, people rationed food, clothing, fuel. Everything was limited. Citizens learned to cook with powdered eggs and substitute meat. Scrap drives collected metal for the war effort. Gardens were planted in every available patch of dirt. Posters reminded people to make do and mend, to keep calm and carry on. And through it all, the radio became a lifeline. News, music, and moments of humor filtered through the static. Churchill's speeches continued to bolster resolve, but just as important were the voices of comedians, musicians, and everyday citizens. Reminders that life, even in wartime, could still be familiar, still be kind, still be worth holding on to. By May of 1941, the Blitz began to fade. Germany turned its attention eastward. The bombs became less frequent. The nights grew quieter, but the scars remained. In the broken bricks, in the missing faces, and in the memory of those who endured. Britain had not fallen, and in the darkness, its people had shown what it meant to stand together. As the bombs fell on Britain, the war expanded elsewhere. In the deserts of North Africa, a different kind of battle began. One fought not in cities, but across vast open terrain, where the sun was relentless and the wind carried sand across the tracks of tanks. It started with Italy. In 1940, Mussolini, seeking to claim his own victories, launched an invasion of British-controlled Egypt from Italian-held Libya. But the Italian army soon found itself overextended, poorly supplied, and vulnerable. British and Commonwealth forces, including soldiers from Australia, India, and South Africa, counterattacked with speed and precision. They pushed deep into Libya, capturing thousands and threatening Italy's hold in the region. Germany responded quickly. In early 1941, Hitler sent reinforcements, a new formation called the Afrika Korps, led by General Erwin Rommel. Rommel was sharp, aggressive, and bold. His tactics earned him respect and a nickname, the Desert Fox. The Desert War unfolded like a series of waves, gains and retreats, victories that lasted weeks, followed by sudden reversals. The terrain made everything harder. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles. Water was precious. Equipment suffered under heat and sand. Maps were unreliable. Landmarks changed with every storm. But even in this remote theater, the stakes were high. Control of North Africa meant control of the Suez Canal, a vital artery connecting Britain to its colonies, and oil supplies in the Middle East. It also opened the door to southern Europe and access to the Mediterranean Sea. In places like Tobruk, El Alamein, and Benghazi, soldiers dug into the sand and waited for orders. At night, the cold could be bitter. During the day, heat shimmered off the dunes. Flies swarmed, dust clung to every surface, and yet the fighting went on. Civilians in nearby towns felt the weight of war too. Supplies ran short, homes were abandoned. Some sought safety in the interior, others stayed, watching columns of tanks pass like steel animals beneath the desert sun. The British Eighth Army became central to the Allied presence in North Africa. They were a multinational force. British, Indian, South African, New Zealander, Australian. They lived in tents and dugouts, wrote letters home, and endured the long silence between offensives. Camels sometimes wandered through camp. Meals were sparse. Sand got into everything. Rommann's Afrika Korps pushed the British back into Egypt in mid-1942, nearly reaching Alexandria, but they were stopped just west of a small railway halt called El Alamein. There, in October of 1942, the Allies launched a counteroffensive under General Bernard Montgomery. The Second Battle of El Alamein would become a turning point. It was loud, slow, grinding. Artillery boomed for days. Tanks clashed across fields of scrub and dust, but the Allied forces held. And then they advanced. Rommel retreated. The Axis began to fall back. Meanwhile, American forces landed further west in French-controlled Morocco and Algeria. An operation called Torch, now caught between two advancing Allied armies, the Axis found themselves surrounded. By May 1943, the campaign was over. More than 250,000 Axis troops surrendered. North Africa was in Allied hands, and the road to Europe was open. But the war had not ended. It had only shifted. And as the desert winds quieted, the next chapter waited, in the mountains of Italy and the icy expanse of the Eastern Front. By the summer of 1941, Hitler believed the time had come to break the uneasy pact with Stalin and take what he saw as rightfully his. To the east lay vast stretches of farmland, rich oil fields, and a population he viewed through the lens of ideology as inferior, expendable. Hitler's war was no longer just territorial. It was ideological, and it was total. The plan was grand in scale and brutal in intention. Operation Barbarossa would become the largest military invasion in human history. At dawn on June 22, 1941, over 3 million Axis troops surged across the Soviet border. They were joined by nearly 600,000 vehicles, 3,500 tanks, and thousands of aircraft. The front stretched over 1,800 miles, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. Soviet defenses were unprepared. Airfields were bombed before planes could take off. Communications lines were cut. In the opening weeks, entire Soviet armies were encircled. More than 500,000 Soviet troops were captured in the Battle of Kiev alone. Columns of prisoners marched west. The Red Army was reeling. But even as cities like Vilnius, Minsk, and Smolensk fell, the Soviet Union did not collapse. Far from it, factories were dismantled and shipped east by train. Hundreds of miles deep into the Ural Mountains, far from the front, workers toiled day and night to rebuild them. Meanwhile, Soviet propaganda rallied the population. Resistance movements formed. Partisans attacked German supply lines. The country, wounded and staggering, refused to surrender. The deeper the Germans pushed, the harder the terrain became. Roads disappeared. Rail gauges didn't match. Horses outnumbered vehicles. Supplies grew thin. And then the weather turned. In October, the skies opened. Autumn rains soaked the earth. Roads became rivers of mud. Tanks stalled. Trucks sank. Soldiers waded knee-deep in muck to pull artillery forward. Progress slowed to a crawl. Still, German forces pushed toward Moscow, the Soviet capital, home to millions, now braced for invasion. Trenches were dug around the outskirts. Civilians were trained to defend the city with rifles or shovels. Stalin chose to stay, broadcasting from the Kremlin, his voice a mix of defiance and fatigue. Then winter arrived in full. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. German troops lacked proper clothing. Boots froze to the ground. Lubricants solidified. Guns failed to fire. Engines cracked in the cold, and the Soviets, now reinforced by fresh troops from Siberia, well equipped and used to the harsh conditions, launched a counter-offensive. The Battle of Moscow turned the tide. German forces were driven back. It was the first major defeat of Hitler's army. It shattered the illusion that the war in the East would be short. Meanwhile, to the north, Leningrad had been surrounded. The siege began in September 1941. Roads in and out were cut. Food supplies dwindled. Residents resorted to boiling leather for soup, grinding wallpaper paste for calories, but still, they held on. Further south, in Ukraine, the battle lines hardened. German troops occupied large swaths of land, enforcing strict rule. Entire villages were razed in reprisal for partisan attacks. Mass graves appeared. The Holocaust by bullets, mass executions of Jews by mobile killing units, was already underway in forests and ravines. Yet through this brutality, the Soviet Union began to recover. It was slow, uneven, often chaotic, but it was relentless. Barbarossa had been launched with confidence and calculation. It ended in frostbite and frustration. By early 1942, what was meant to be a swift campaign had become a grinding war of attrition, and as the snow settled over the Eastern Front, soldiers dug deeper into the ice. Trenches froze in place. Families huddled in shelters. Supplies ran low. But the war, cold, vast and merciless, was far from over. To the north, while Moscow braced for winter battles, another city faced a different kind of terror, a long, suffocating grip that would stretch nearly 900 days. Leningrad, once called St. Petersburg, was surrounded, and the siege that followed became one of the most harrowing chapters of the war. In September 1941, German forces approached the city from the south, while Finnish troops pressed in from the north. Together, they cut off roads, railways and waterways. Supply lines vanished. Leningrad was encircled, not stormed, but isolated. The plan was not to capture the city by force, but to starve it into submission. Inside the city, over 2 million people remained. Civilians and soldiers, families and children. At first, there was hope that the siege might lift quickly. But as weeks turned into months, and autumn turned to winter, that hope began to dim. Food became the greatest enemy. Rations were cut again and again. At the lowest point, adults received just 125 grams of bread per day, much of it made from sawdust or other fillers. People boiled wallpaper paste for nutrients. They scraped glue from furniture. Pets disappeared. Entire families collapsed from hunger while walking to work or standing in line for rations. Winter made it worse. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees. Fuel was scarce. Pipes froze. Buildings grew cold. People burned books, furniture, anything they could find to generate warmth. Hospitals overflowed with the weak and the dying. Morgues could not keep up. And yet, life went on. Orchestras still rehearsed. The Leningrad Symphony performed Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in 1942, its swelling notes echoing through a starving city, broadcast over loudspeakers to show the world that the city still lived. Schools held classes underground. Artists sketched the frozen streets. Teachers gave lessons by candlelight. Supply trucks began crossing Lake Ladoga, frozen solid in winter, known then as the Road of Life. At great risk, drivers ferried flour, medicine, and hope across ice marked by shell fire. Many trucks fell through cracks or were hit by bombs, but some made it enough to keep the city breathing. Children were evacuated, but not all could leave. Those who stayed learned to navigate a world of darkness and ration books. They wrote diaries. Some of those diaries survive. Simple, quiet words describing loss, fear, and resilience. Leningrad did not fall. Despite the cold, the hunger, and the unrelenting pressure from German artillery, the city endured. It became a symbol of Soviet resistance, of civilian courage, of stubborn survival against impossible odds. When the siege finally lifted in January 1944, the city had paid dearly. Estimates vary, but over 1 million people may have died, mostly civilians, mostly from hunger and cold. Streets once filled with markets and music were now quiet. Graves filled parks and courtyards, but the people had held on. Leningrad had survived not just a military campaign, but an attempt to erase it from the map through silence, and in doing so, it became something more, an enduring reminder of what ordinary people can endure and what cannot be taken, even by war. Far to the south, along the banks of the Volga River, another city prepared for a battle that would define the course of the war. Stalingrad, an industrial hub, a transportation lifeline, and a city bearing Stalin's own name, stood in the path of the German advance. What happened there would mark a turning point, not just in the Eastern Front, but in the entire conflict. In the summer of 1942, Germany launched a renewed offensive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, but Stalingrad stood in the way. It was to be taken quickly, another city captured, another objective secured. But Stalingrad would not fall easily. The city became a battlefield, unlike any other. Streets turned into trenches. Buildings became fortresses. Every room, every floor, every stairwell was contested. The front line shifted by meters, not miles. Snipers waited in shadows. Grenades were exchanged between windows. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in shattered factories and burned-out homes. The Germans called it the Rat War, a maze of rubble and death. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Many had been evacuated, but thousands remained, trapped by the speed of the assault, or unwilling to leave their homes. They sought shelter in basements. They carried water under fire. Some joined the fight, digging trenches, clearing rubble, or passing ammunition. The Volga River became lifeblood. Supplies were ferried across under constant bombardment. Wounded soldiers were taken back the same way. Boats moved day and night. Despite the risk, Soviet reinforcements arrived in waves, clinging to the far bank until they could cross. As summer turned to autumn, the battle only intensified. The city was flattened, yet the fighting did not stop. The Soviets, under General Vasily Chukov, dug in. They refused to give ground. Not one step back, the order said, and they followed it. Then, in November 1942, came the turning point. In a massive operation called Uranus, Soviet forces launched a counteroffensive, not directly at the Germans inside Stalingrad, but at their flanks. Romanian and Hungarian units, less equipped and poorly positioned, were overwhelmed. The trap closed. Nearly 300,000 Axis troops were encircled. Inside the city, German soldiers found themselves cut off. Supplies ran low. Temperatures dropped. They had no winter clothing, no reliable food, and no way out. Hitler ordered them to stay, to fight to the last man. By January, the situation had become desperate. Frostbite spread. Ammunition was rationed. Starving men fought over crumbs. Some surrendered. Others held on until the bitter end. On February 2nd, 1943. The last German units in Stalingrad laid down their arms. It was one of the largest defeats in military history. Of the hundreds of thousands who had marched toward the city, only a fraction returned. Stalingrad had become more than a battle. It was a symbol of Soviet endurance, of German overreach, of how far a nation could bend without breaking. The rubble that once echoed with gunfire now held silence, and across the world, that silence was heard. Even as the Soviet Union reclaimed ground in the East, the Allies sought to strike at the so-called soft underbelly of Axis Europe. With North Africa secured, attention turned north to Sicily, to the Italian peninsula, and to the next phase of the campaign. In July 1943, Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. British and American troops landed along the southern coast, under the cover of darkness, supported by naval bombardments and waves of aircraft. Resistance was sharp at first. German and Italian forces fought to hold the island, but within weeks, the Allies advanced inland, capturing towns, seizing airfields, and gaining control of vital mountain passes. Sicily fell in just over a month, and with its loss came political tremors. Benito Mussolini, long the face of fascist Italy, was deposed. He was arrested by order of the king, and Italy soon began secret negotiations with the Allies. But Germany would not let its southern partner leave the war so easily. In September 1943, the Allies landed on the Italian mainland, first at Salerno, then later further south. Though Italy had agreed to an armistice, German forces quickly occupied the country, disarmed Italian troops, and fortified the mountains. Italy was no longer just a battleground. It had become a front line between retreating Axis forces and advancing Allies. The geography of Italy made everything harder. Mountains crisscrossed the peninsula, rivers carved natural defenses, and every village, every ridge, every narrow road became a fortress. German troops, under Field Marshal Kesselring, executed a masterful defense, slowing the Allied advance to a crawl. Winter came, and with it, mud, snow, and bitter cold. Soldiers climbed through hills in freezing rain. They built roads where none existed. They lived in foxholes and ruins. Progress was measured not in miles, but in yards. In January 1944, hoping to break the stalemate, the Allies launched an amphibious landing at Anzio, just south of Rome. The plan was to bypass the heavily fortified Gustav Line and threaten German supply routes, but the landing stalled. German forces surrounded the beachhead. For months, fighting continued in trenches and rubble. Casualties mounted. The breakout didn't come until May. Meanwhile, to the south, one of the fiercest battles of the campaign raged at Monte Cassino. The ancient monastery atop the hill overlooked a crucial valley. The Allies bombed it, then fought their way up through waves of German paratroopers. The monastery was reduced to ruins, the valley below soaked with months of bloodshed. Finally, in June 1944, Rome was liberated. It was the first Axis capital to fall. Crowds gathered, flags waved. But the war in Italy was far from over. Fighting would continue up the peninsula for another year. Town by town, ridge by ridge, the Allies pushed north. German resistance remained fierce, and for many soldiers, it was a campaign marked by exhaustion, mud, and loss. Yet through it all, the advance continued. Italy had entered the war as an Axis power. Now it had become the ground on which fascism slowly unraveled. And with every step, the Allies moved closer to Germany itself. As the Italian campaign pressed onward through mud and mountains, Allied commanders turned their attention to a far more daring and decisive goal: the liberation of Western Europe. Years of planning, deception, and build-up had led to this moment. The time had come to cross the English Channel and strike at the very heart of Nazi control in France. The operation was called Overlord. Its opening salvo would come to be known as D-Day, June 6, 1944. But long before the first boots hit the beaches, the skies were already full. On the night of June 5th, thousands of paratroopers and glider infantry from the United States, Britain, and other Allied nations took off in waves. Their mission: to land deep behind German lines, capture key bridges and crossroads, and delay reinforcements. The night was chaotic. Strong winds scattered formations. Some landed in swamps and rivers. Others dropped directly into enemy fire. But despite the confusion and heavy losses, many objectives were taken. Roads were blocked. German command was thrown into disarray before dawn ever broke. Then came the main assault. As the first light touched the coast of Normandy, the largest amphibious invasion in human history began. Naval vessels, nearly 7,000 of them, filled the channel. Warships shelled German defenses from afar, while landing craft surged toward shore. There were 5 beaches: Utah and Omaha, assigned to the Americans, Gold and Sword to the British, and Juno to the Canadians. Each beach presented its own challenges: rough tides, mined obstacles, and fortified positions overlooking the sand. At Omaha Beach, the conditions were particularly deadly. The tides pushed landing craft off course. Soldiers were met with walls of machine gun fire before they even reached dry land. Many drowned under heavy packs. Others were cut down within moments of landing. But slowly, inch by inch, they advanced, finding cover behind tank traps, using smoke for concealment, and scaling the bluffs to silence the guns. Elsewhere, the landings met greater success. At Utah Beach, strong currents carried American forces to a less defended area, an accident that may have saved thousands of lives. British and Canadian troops advanced through heavy fire at Gold, Juno, and Sword, eventually linking their beachheads and pushing inland. By the end of the day, over 150,000 troops had landed. The Allies had established a fragile but growing foothold in France. But the battle for Normandy had only just begun. The countryside was not open plains, but dense hedgerow, bucodrics, thick earth walls, and tangled vegetation that turned every field into a natural fortress. Tanks couldn't pass through easily. Soldiers had to move hedge by hedge, clearing each with grenades, rifles, and flamethrowers. The Germans, experienced and entrenched, counterattacked with intensity. Panzer divisions struck from concealed positions. Snipers hid in church towers. Mortars rained down from behind hedgerows. Cities like Caen were bombed, captured, lost, and captured again. Entire towns were reduced to rubble. Casualties mounted. For every mile gained, the cost was steep, and for the people of Normandy, liberation came with sorrow. Thousands of civilians died in the fighting. Homes burned, families fled. The land bore scars that would remain for generations. But the Allies adapted. New tactics were developed to breach the hedgerows: explosives mounted on tanks, coordinated airstrikes, and careful coordination between infantry and armor. Operation Cobra, launched in late July, shattered German lines with overwhelming force. The breakout was finally achieved. By mid-August, The Allies encircled German forces in the Falaise pocket. Thousands were captured. Others fled east, leaving wreckage behind. The road to Paris lay open. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. Crowds filled the boulevards. The French resistance emerged from the shadows. Flags waved from balconies. And as General Charles de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées, bells rang through the city for the first time in years. Normandy had been the beginning. Bloody, chaotic, but victorious. Over 425,000 Allied and German troops were killed, wounded, or missing in the campaign. The beaches, once soaked with blood, would become places of quiet remembrance. And beyond them, the Allies now marched east, toward Germany. As the summer of 1944 turned to autumn, the Allies pressed eastward. France had been liberated. Belgium and Luxembourg followed. American, British, and Canadian troops advanced across the countryside, liberating town after town. German forces, battered and retreating, fell back toward their own borders. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the end of the war might be near. But Hitler had other plans. In the quiet forests of the Ardennes, he prepared one final, desperate counter-offensive. His goal was bold: to punch through the Allied lines, split their forces, and recapture the port of Antwerp. A successful strike, he believed, could force a negotiated peace in the West and allow him to focus on the Eastern Front. The Allies didn't expect it. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, too rugged for a major attack. Many units stationed there were under strength or resting. Morale was high. Christmas was approaching. Then, on December 16, 1944, the forests erupted. Under a dark winter sky, German artillery pounded Allied positions. Waves of tanks and infantry surged through the snow. Caught off guard, the front lines bent, then broke. Entire units were overrun. Communication lines were cut. Fog and clouds grounded Allied aircraft, giving the Germans an early advantage. The front bulged outward, hence the name, the Battle of the Bulge. Towns were encircled, roads clogged with retreating vehicles. Supply depots were seized. In some places, American troops held fast. The town of Bastogne became a symbol of resistance. Surrounded on all sides, low on supplies, and battered by constant attack, the 101st Airborne Division refused to surrender. When German officers demanded the town surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe replied with one word: nuts. For days, the battle raged. The cold was punishing. Snow piled high. Soldiers dug frozen foxholes, wrapped their feet in rags, and rationed what little they had. Frostbite became as much a threat as enemy fire, but the Allies held on. As the skies cleared, Allied aircraft returned. Bombers struck supply lines. Fighters harassed German convoys, and fresh divisions arrived to reinforce the front. General Patton's Third Army, marching north through the snow, reached Bastogne and broke the siege. Gradually, the tide turned. The German advance slowed, then stalled. Fuel shortages crippled their armor. Resistance stiffened. The Bulge collapsed. By late January 1945, the Germans had been pushed back to their original positions. They had lost tanks, men, and precious time. It was their last major offensive in the West. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces during the war. Nearly 90,000 US troops were killed, wounded, or captured, but they had stopped the offensive. The road to Germany lay open once again. Winter began to thaw. Rivers swelled with melting snow, and across the front, Allied troops prepared for the final push. With the Ardennes quiet once more, the Allies turned their full attention to Germany itself. It was early 1945, and across two massive fronts, the noose was tightening. To the west, American, British, Canadian and French forces regrouped, resupplied, and surged forward. To the east, the Red Army had regained momentum and was pushing rapidly through Poland and into the heart of Eastern Europe. Germany was being squeezed from both sides, and the end, though still distant, was beginning to take shape. The Rhine River, long a symbolic and strategic barrier, became the next major objective. In March 1945, American forces reached its banks and began crossing under heavy fire. One of the most famous crossings came at Remagen, where US troops unexpectedly found the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. They captured it and rushed men and armor across before it collapsed days later. The bridgehead became a vital corridor into the German heartland. As Allied forces poured into Western Germany, resistance remained fierce but uneven. Some towns surrendered quickly, others fought to the last man. German cities, scarred by years of bombing, now witnessed street battles and artillery fire as tanks rolled through the rubble. Meanwhile, British and Canadian troops moved across northern Germany, liberating concentration camps and cutting off retreating German units. In the south, French forces pushed through Bavaria, while American units drove into the industrial heart of the Ruhr. In the east, the Soviet advance was swift and unstoppable. After brutal fighting in Warsaw and East Prussia, the Red Army pressed into German territory. Cities fell in succession. Refugees streamed westward, fleeing ahead of the front. The roads were filled with carts, bicycles, and broken-down vehicles, all carrying what little families could salvage. As April began, the Allies met little resistance outside Leipzig, Nuremberg, and Frankfurt, but every step forward came with new discoveries. In the forests and valleys of Western Germany, American troops began uncovering the realities of Nazi crimes. Concentration camps like Buchenwald and Dachau, where survivors were found emaciated and barely alive. The true scale of horror began to come into focus. Back in Berlin, Hitler's world was collapsing. The city was under siege. Soviet artillery pounded its outskirts. Inside his bunker, Hitler issued desperate orders to divisions that no longer existed. Civilians were conscripted to fight. Teenagers and old men were handed rifles. As the Soviets closed in, Berlin became a battlefield. Buildings crumbled. Streets turned into rivers of dust and debris. Every block was contested, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life in his bunker beneath the city. Days later, German forces began surrendering across Europe. On May 7th, Germany formally capitulated to Allied forces in Reims, France. The next day, the surrender was repeated for the Soviets in Berlin. May 8th became known as VE Day. Victory in Europe. Across the continent, celebrations erupted. Flags waved, bells rang. People danced in the streets. The war in Europe was finally over. But the world was not yet at peace. In the Pacific, the conflict raged on, and a final terrible chapter was still to be written. Long before American boots landed in Europe, tensions were rising across the Pacific Ocean. For decades, Japan had pursued a path of imperial expansion. The island nation, rich in ambition, but poor in natural resources, looked outward to secure its future. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, carving out a puppet state called Manchukuo. The world watched with concern, but little action was taken. It was a test, and Japan had passed it without consequence. By 1937, the ambitions grew larger. Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. Cities fell one after another: Shanghai, Beijing, and then Nanjing, where horrific atrocities were committed against civilians and prisoners. The war in China would stretch on for years, consuming resources and deepening Japan's need for supplies, especially oil, rubber, and steel. The United States and its allies, alarmed by Japanese aggression, responded with economic pressure. They froze Japanese assets, imposed embargoes, cut off access to critical materials. Japan, rather than back down, chose a path of confrontation. In the shadows of diplomacy, military plans took shape. Japan believed that war with the United States was inevitable. If conflict was to come, it would begin on Japan's terms. And so, in the early morning hours of December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes appeared in the skies above Pearl Harbor. The harbor was quiet. It was a Sunday. Battleships sat at anchor. Sailors were still at breakfast. Then the first bombs fell. The attack was swift and devastating. Torpedoes tore through hulls. Bombs struck decks and hangars. Fires raged. The USS Arizona exploded and sank with over 1,000 men aboard. In just under 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans were killed. Battleships, cruisers, and aircraft were left in ruin. It was a blow meant to cripple the US Pacific Fleet and buy Japan time to secure its empire. The following day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation. He called December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The world was now fully at war. Japan struck across the Pacific. Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Their expansion was rapid and coordinated. Fortresses fell, prisoners were taken, and across the Pacific, Allied forces scrambled to respond. The Pacific Theater had opened with fire, and it would rage for years across islands, oceans, jungles, and skies. But in those early days, one thing was clear: Japan had awakened a giant. In the days and weeks following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan moved with startling speed. Its forces swept across the Pacific, launching a series of invasions and assaults designed to knock out Allied power before it could fully respond. British territories in Southeast Asia fell in quick succession. Hong Kong surrendered after just 17 days. Malaya crumbled soon after. Singapore, once thought to be an impregnable fortress, was taken in February 1942. It was the largest surrender of British-led forces in history. To the south, the Dutch East Indies, rich in oil and resources, were seized. Japanese planes dominated the skies. Warships controlled the sea lanes. Entire fleets were either sunk or scattered. But one of the most critical and harrowing chapters unfolded in the Philippines. American and Filipino troops, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, braced for the inevitable. When Japanese forces landed, they came with overwhelming strength. Coastal defenses were breached, supply lines were cut, and soon the defenders were forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, a narrow strip of land where tens of thousands of soldiers made a final stand. For months, they held out. The conditions were brutal. Ammunition ran low. Food became scarce. Malaria and dysentery spread. Soldiers fought under constant bombardment and dwindling hope. The heat was stifling. Water, sometimes contaminated, was rationed drop by drop. MacArthur was ordered to evacuate. He left reluctantly, famously promising, "I shall return." The defenders were left behind to face what came next. On April 9, 1942, Bataan fell. Over 75,000 American and Filipino troops were taken prisoner. The largest surrender of US forces in history. What followed became known as the Bedtime Death March. The prisoners were forced to walk over 60 miles in searing heat, without food or water. Those who collapsed were beaten. Many were executed. Thousands died along the road. It was one of the darkest moments of the war. Weeks later, the island fortress of Corregidor fell, and the Philippines was under full Japanese control. The Allied position in the Pacific was shattered. But even in defeat, a seed of resistance remained. Guerrilla fighters took to the mountains and jungles. Radios whispered news from afar, and across the Pacific, plans were already forming for a long, hard road back. After a string of stunning victories, Japan's momentum in the Pacific seemed unstoppable. But in the spring of 1942, the tide began to shift. The first signs came at the Battle of the Coral Sea. In early May, Japanese forces advanced toward Port Moresby in New Guinea, a strategic location that, if captured, would threaten Australia. But American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese communications. US Navy carriers moved to intercept. What followed was the first naval battle in history, where opposing ships never saw each other. Aircraft launched from carriers fought the entire engagement. Planes dueled in the skies, dropped torpedoes and bombed decks. Both sides suffered heavy losses. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho, and the US carrier Lexington was sunk. But the invasion was halted. Japan had been stopped for the first time. The balance had not yet tipped. But the crack in Japanese invincibility had begun to show. Then came Midway. In June 1942, Japanese Admiral Yamamoto launched an ambitious plan to lure and destroy the remaining US carriers. The goal: eliminate American naval power in the Pacific in one decisive blow. Again, codebreakers played a crucial role. American intelligence discovered the target, Midway Atoll, and set a trap. On June 4th, the battle began. Japanese planes bombed Midway's defenses, while their fleet maneuvered nearby. US aircraft, flying from both land and sea, launched counterattacks. Early waves failed to hit their targets. Many were shot down. But timing and luck turned the tide. As Japanese carriers were rearming planes for a second strike, American dive bombers arrived. In minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were set ablaze and sinking. A fourth, Hiryu, was destroyed hours later. The US lost the carrier Yorktown. But the victory was decisive. Midway changed everything. Japan had lost 4 frontline carriers and hundreds of seasoned pilots. It was a blow they would never fully recover from. For the United States, it was a moment of resilience, precision, and hope. The Pacific War was far from over. But at Midway, the tide had turned. From that point on, the Allies would slowly, relentlessly, begin to push back. With Japan's momentum stalled at Midway, the Allies began a slow and grinding advance across the Pacific. The strategy was known as island hopping, capturing strategic islands one by one, bypassing others, and moving steadily toward the Japanese mainland. The first major test came at Guadalcanal. Located in the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal held a key airfield under construction by the Japanese. If completed, it would threaten Allied supply lines to Australia. The US launched a surprise landing on August 7th. Marines came ashore to light resistance, but the battle was far from over. For 6 brutal months, fighting raged across jungle trails, ridges, and river crossings. Japanese troops launched wave after wave of night attacks. Naval battles lit up the seas nearby. Control of the island shifted repeatedly. The conditions were grueling. Heat and humidity sapped strength. Disease, especially malaria, ran rampant. Supplies were scarce. Soldiers lived in mud, dug foxholes, and survived on limited rations. But the Allies held on. Slowly, they pushed the enemy back. By February 1943, Japanese forces evacuated the island. It was the first major Allied land victory in the Pacific. Guadalcanal proved that Japan could be beaten on the ground. It also showed what kind of war this would be. Slow, savage, and fought in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. From there, the campaign stretched across the Central Pacific. Tarawa came next, a tiny atoll, fortified with bunkers, machine guns, and barbed wire. The battle lasted only 3 days in November 1943, but the cost was staggering. Over 1,000 US Marines were killed, many in the first moments of the landing. The tide, coral reefs, and Japanese defenses turned the beaches into a deadly trap. Then came the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, Saipan, and Guam. Each battle followed a brutal pattern: amphibious assaults, fanatical resistance, and costly victory. Japanese soldiers often fought to the last man. Civilians too suffered terribly. Many were caught between 2 armies, or took their own lives out of fear and propaganda. Airfields on captured islands brought Japan within range of heavy bombers. The B-29 superfortresses began missions over the home islands. Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya now felt the war firsthand. Yet Japan did not surrender. Its military leaders vowed to resist to the end. As the Allies moved closer, 2 names came to define the cost of the campaign: Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But those came later. For now, the island-hopping campaign had begun in earnest, and the road ahead was long. As the Pacific War drew closer to Japan's doorstep, the final island battles became tests, not just of military strength, but of will, endurance, and human cost. No 2 battles demonstrated this more than Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Iwo Jima, just 750 miles from Tokyo, was a small volcanic island of black sand and jagged ridges. To the American High Command, it was a strategic prize. Its airfields could serve as emergency landing strips for B-29 bombers and provide fighter escort range for raids over the Japanese mainland. But to the Japanese, it was a fortress. The invasion began on February 19, 1945. After days of heavy naval and aerial bombardment, US Marines stormed the beaches in waves, expecting resistance to be broken. But the Japanese commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had prepared a different strategy. Instead of defending the shoreline, his troops waited in hidden bunkers, interconnected tunnels, and fortified positions deep inland. When the trap was sprung, chaos followed. The volcanic ash beneath the Marines' boots offered no cover. Tanks bogged down. Artillery fire zeroed in. The defenders struck with precision and discipline. The Americans, exposed and struggling to gain footing, fought under constant fire. The landscape itself became a weapon. Sulphurous air, sharp rock, and narrow paths turned every advance into a deadly gamble. Progress was measured in feet. One of the early objectives was Mount Suribachi, a dormant volcano rising over the southern tip of the island. After days of intense fighting, Marines reached the summit and raised a small flag. Later, a second, larger flag was raised, an image captured by photographer Joe Rosenthal that became an enduring symbol of sacrifice and perseverance. But Suribachi was only the beginning. For another month, fighting continued across the northern plains and ravines. Every cave had to be cleared. Flamethrowers and grenades became essential tools. Japanese troops launched desperate night attacks, many choosing death over capture. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 1,000 survived. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed, and over 20,000 wounded. The island was secured, but at a cost that stunned even the battle-hardened. Then came Okinawa, the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War. Okinawa was Japan's last stronghold before the home islands, with a civilian population exceeding 300,000. The island was a mix of farmland, steep hills, and labyrinthine cave networks. The battle began on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, with an initially unopposed landing by over 180,000 Allied troops. But the silence was deceptive. Japanese forces, commanded by General Mitsuru Ushijima, had entrenched themselves in the southern part of the island, preparing for a prolonged defense. As US troops advanced, they encountered the Shuri Line, a network of bunkers, tunnels, and artillery positions carved into the limestone ridges. Rain turned the battlefield to mud. Troops waded through flooded rice paddies, only to be met with machine gun fire from hidden positions. Each ridge, Kakazu, Sugarloaf, Shuri Heights, became synonymous with agony. The Japanese defended with desperation. When pushed back, they counterattacked. Kamikaze pilots targeted Allied naval vessels offshore, sinking dozens and damaging hundreds more. Civilians, caught in the middle, suffered immensely. Many were forced into labor, others were used as human shields, and in heartbreaking numbers, civilians took their own lives, misled by propaganda, interfering Allied troops. The cost was staggering. Over 12,000 Americans were killed. More than 36,000 were wounded. Japanese military deaths neared 100,000. Civilian casualties ranged between 75,000 and 100,000. Villages were reduced to rubble. Cultural landmarks were obliterated. Families were shattered. By June 22nd, the island was declared secure. Okinawa had fallen, but it left behind deep scars and a chilling forecast of what a mainland invasion might entail. If this was the cost of one island, what would it take to end the war? The answer was about to emerge from the laboratories of Los Alamos and the deserts of New Mexico. As the Pacific Campaign dragged into the summer of 1945, the toll on both sides had become staggering. Battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa had shown that the path to Tokyo would be lined with devastation, and Allied commanders feared that an invasion of the Japanese home islands might cost millions of lives. But even as ships moved and troops prepared, a secret project, years in the making, was nearing completion, known as the Manhattan Project. It had drawn together some of the greatest scientific minds of the era in a race to harness the power of the atom. In the deserts of New Mexico, under strictest secrecy, the first atomic bomb was tested in July 1945. The explosion lit up the sky with a brilliance never before seen. It was a success, and it changed everything. Japan, meanwhile, was refusing to surrender. Its cities were already being reduced to ashes by conventional bombing raids. Tokyo had been firebombed in March, killing over 100,000 people in a single night. And still, no capitulation came. The Japanese military remained defiant. The emperor remained silent. On August 6, 1945, a single American bomber, the Enola Gay, took off from the island of Tinian. Its target, the city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was dropped. The explosion leveled the city. In an instant, tens of thousands were killed. The sky turned white. Shadows were burned into walls. Fires raged for days, and radiation began to spread. Still, Japan did not surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped, this time on the city of Nagasaki. The terrain and size of the city offered slightly more protection, but the devastation was still horrific. Thousands more died instantly. Thousands more would die in the weeks to come. Faced with unimaginable destruction and fearing that more bombs might follow, Emperor Hirohito finally spoke. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender. For many in the country, it was the first time they had ever heard the emperor's voice. The formal surrender took place on September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. Allied and Japanese officials signed the documents. The war was over. After 6 long years, World War II had come to an end. The cost had been beyond comprehension. More than 70 million lives lost, cities destroyed, nations reshaped. But for that moment, the guns fell silent, flags were lowered, and peace, however fragile, had finally returned. The war had ended, but its echoes lingered. Across Europe and the Pacific, ruins stretched for miles. Cities once vibrant were now silent fields of stone and ash. Families searched for loved ones. Some would never be found. Others returned home forever changed, and many never returned at all. In Germany, the Nuremberg trials began, seeking justice for crimes so vast they defied imagination. In Japan, American forces led a peaceful occupation. The emperor remained, but the government changed. War was outlawed in a new constitution. Nations grieved, rebuilt, remembered. The world looked inward and outward all at once. Borders were redrawn. Old alliances faded. New tensions grew, and amid the debris, something quiet but lasting began to take root. A fragile hope that such destruction might never happen again. Memorials rose on former battlefields. Names were etched into granite walls. Flags folded with care were passed to the next of kin, and stories once too painful to speak began to be told. In time, those stories became history, and history became memory. Now, as the decades have passed, we still reflect on bravery and loss, on cruelty and compassion, on what was endured and what was learned. It was a war that spanned continents, consumed nations, and defined a generation. And now, as your eyes grow heavy and your breath slows, may this quiet remembering carry you gently into rest. The war is over. You are safe. Good night.